opportunity, and compensation in college sports. To my immediate left is Jane McManus, our moderator, who has written for ESPN, Deadspin, the New York Daily News, and is the editor of the year's best sports writing. She is also a former executive director of Seton Hall University's Center for Sport Media, who has appeared on national shows such as Good Morning America, CNN, and NPR. To Jane's left is Arthur Bryant of Bailey Glasser, LLP, a lawyer who has won major victories in civil rights, constitutional law, consumer protection, and was the lead trial counsel in the first Title IX case. To Arthur's left is Jeffrey Kessler, the co-executive chairman of Winston & Strawn, who is one of the world's leading antitrust, sports law, and trial lawyers. To Jeffrey's left is Michelle Roberts, former executive director of the NBA Players Association. A trial lawyer, Michelle has worked on behalf of NBA players to ensure their rights were protected and they were compensated fairly. To Michelle's left is Brittany Whiteside, Vice President of Collegiate Partnerships with Altia Sports Partners, who has served at the University of Virginia on the athletic department's executive leadership team, overseeing corporate sponsorships, branding, marketing, broadcast, and strategic revenue generation, while also overseeing diversity, equity, inclusion, and Title IX planning. It's all yours, Jane.
Thank you all so much for being here. What an incredible panel, I have to say. It's a little intimidating to moderate a panel of this heft, but I think it's going to give us a real chance to get into some of these issues and where things are right now. When it comes to name, image, and likeness, the idea of compensation, unionization, all of these different issues that seem to be on the horizon, or are they? So what I'd love for each of you to do now is if we could just go down the line and if you could explain kind of what are the most pertinent issues in the space that you're personally working in right now. So whether that's, Title IX, the legal challenges, unionization, and then collectives, kind of how do you see the area evolving?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really honored to be invited. To me, I've done more Title IX cases for women athletes, and for male athletes for that matter, than anybody in the country. I was the lead trial counsel in the very first such case back in, I'm showing how old I am now, in 1985 against Temple University, and I'm still doing, we just sued the University of Oregon. Never lost a case, not because I'm a great lawyer, because they're all in violation. That's what's going on here. Every single school that's been threatened with a lawsuit has either, 80% of the ones I threatened to sue settle without a lawsuit because they're so blatantly in violation. The others we won. And that's what everybody's done who's brought these cases, because the schools are openly in violation of Title IX. And so for me, the fundamental thing I'm focused on is to be ready to sue the schools because you've got strong causes of action and you can get them into compliance. I want the NCAA held accountable for violating Title IX. It's taking the position it's not covered by Title IX. It is. I want Title IX expanded to cover NIL payments. We've just sued the University of Oregon. Let me give you one quick example, and then I'll pass it down the line. University of Oregon, which I was astonished to learn this about that school. It's got so much money, it's called Nike University, right? I mean, because Phil Knight came from there. And the co-owner of Nike was their former track coach, men's track and field coach. They created a women's beach volleyball team 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the only varsity team in the university and in the Power 5 that has not a single dollar of athletic financial aid 10 years later, right? They would never do that to a men's varsity team. They have no locker room on campus. They have no practice or competitive facility. They are literally required to practice and compete at a local state park next to, and uses the bathroom, a cinder block bathroom where there are no, the public bathroom, where there are no doors on the stalls because there's so much drug and alcohol use there. This is a college varsity athletic experience. And the Oregonian exposed it in a big expose where women get 44% of the athletic financial aid. They are cheated out of $900,000 a year in athletic financial aid. 25% of the athletic expenditures go on the women, who are 49% of the athletes, and 15% of the recruiting dollars are spent on the women. And that's one of the premier intercollegiate athletic universities in the country, you know, playing for the national championship or close to it in football, competing same kind of level at basketball. It's got to stop. And so, sorry to go on so long, but that's my primary focus in this whole area. Whatever happens with everything else, the women are entitled under the law to equal opportunities to participate, equal athletic financial aid, and equal treatment. And that's what we've got to get.
Thanks. And for you, I feel like every day it's a new thing with NIL and what's happening in the courts, and, you know, with the NCAA being pushed in different directions on athlete compensation, and you're in the middle of that.
Yeah, so I'm Jeff Kessler. Hello, everybody. I've spent much of my professional life working on behalf of the economic rights of athletes, but in BS football and big-time Division I basketball had become, in the Power 5 conferences, to anything else in the university. They had become multi-billion-dollar businesses that were larger than the revenues of the NBA, larger than the revenues of Major League Baseball, and larger than the revenues of the National Hockey League. They're second in this country only to the National Football League. The athletes who generated all of that revenue, most of whom would never make it to the pros, were largely athletes of color. The NCAA took the position that they were preventing these athletes from being exploited by not paying them. This struck a chord, having spent my life defending athletes in the professional world, people like Michelle, on this, and we concluded something had to be done. So, along with my colleagues at Winston and Strawn, we filed a case called Jenkins versus the NCAA back in 2015. Tim Dennis, who's right there, was involved in that at our time at our firm. And we were shortly, at the same time, joined by the Alston case, filed by another law firm, the Higgins-Bourbon law firm, and the Pierre Simon law firm. And we joined together in an MDL, which became the Alston litigation, that made its way 5.5, 6 years later to the United States Supreme Court, where I had the privilege to argue that case. And lo and behold, we discovered that whether you were the most conservative justice or the most liberal justice, the one thing you could agree on is that the NCAA's rules were not right. There was not a single dissenting voice, and I'm involved in 3 of those cases, which are rapidly coming to a resolution one way or another. One of those cases is House versus NCAA, which is seeking to apply the antitrust laws to the NIL rules that were in the past and the NIL rules that remain. Part of that case is seeking damages to the athletes for having their NIL used in broadcast agreements, which is a lot of value over the last 4 years and a little bit beyond that. That case will go to trial to a jury in January, coming up in 2025. We're also seeking an injunction to do things like the state of Virginia did yesterday, which is allow the schools directly to compensate the athletes for their NIL. That's one of the cases we have pending. Another one, a rather narrow case, is called Hubbard versus the NCAA. That is seeking the damages for what the Supreme Court held to be illegal in Alston, which is the idea of giving educational benefits to the athletes, which are now allowed, and many, many schools give out what's now been commonly called Alston payments, which are awards for making progress in your school towards your degree and keeping your academic standing. And we're seeking damages for those athletes who couldn't get them because of the illegal system that was in effect. And I can say confidence is illegal because 9 justices of the Supreme Court have said that. Then the biggest case we have was most recently filed, is called Carter versus the NCAA. That one's got a while to go. Hubbard, by the way, will go to trial in December. So we got 2 trials coming up. Carter is seeking to get rid of the remaining rules that the NCAA have against each of the conferences being able to make their own choices about whether or not to compensate their athletes and how for the revenues that they generate. So that is what I'm doing in this world, and I'm happy to talk about that and answer questions about it that I'm sure people will have.
Well, well, James, as far as what I'm doing at present, I'm trying to enjoy my retirement. that is my primary focus these days. But in all seriousness, what I'm really hoping to see happen, and I know it will, is that Jeffrey will win all of those cases. I'm probably the one person that doesn't belong on this panel because I was never a student athlete, and professionally, I've never represented a student athlete. But the reason it makes sense for me to be engaged in this conversation, I suppose, is because I did, until I retired, spent almost 10 years representing professional athletes. And what struck me back in 2015 was the similarity between the NBA and the amount of revenue it generated and these big college schools and the revenue they were generating, and the fact that my guys were making millions of dollars and those kids weren't making anything. I mean, it just struck me as being a little difficult to swallow. I also heard stories of kids who would go to sleep hungry at some of the very same schools that were generating millions and billions of dollars. And as Jeffrey pointed out, not all of those kids are going to make it to the NBA. In fact, I don't have to tell you, most people are not going to make it into the NBA. There are only 450, 500 jobs available at all. So those kids with all that talent who are generating revenue are likely not to see their work generate any revenue that they can put in their own pockets. And so it didn't take long for me as a union executive to think, how do you justify this? And so what I'm doing is, again, happily retired, but watching this train, which has left the station, hopefully park itself at a place where these kids, who, as Jeffrey points out, many of them look like me, can enjoy the fruits of their labor. They are employees, in my view, in every sense of the word. I've not been of the view that anybody who works and generates revenue should not have a right to share in that revenue. And I understand, believe me, that it's a complicated question when it comes to educational institutions. I get it. The NBA is a for-profit entity, and as I understand it, these schools are not-for-profits. Having said that, if you're making billions of dollars, you explain to me why that should be sufficient for you to keep it all. So I'm just watching and waiting. If you need the co-counsel, Jeff, don't call me, but I'm happy to help in other ways if I can.
Right, thanks. And Brittany, I think the collective space is a bit of a black box in some ways, and what happens with that, and then not part of the university system, so separate from that, how is an 18-year-old, 19-year-old athlete supposed to even know how to begin to navigate this world?
Yeah, when you think about like the evolution of the landscape, you talked a little bit about the collectives. We talked about like where we started. We were in a pre-NIL environment in 2020. I was an administrator at University of Virginia, thinking about how to help support athletes, how to navigate this, right? Many institutions to start took a hands-off approach, really looked at how do we look at education and policy? What do we need to do to really start to think about how to navigate this new landscape? 2021 comes and we start to see this change a little bit, right? We start to see education policy 2022 collectives come into play, and you talk about what that is and what that means for the landscape. And I like to think about NIL in like two boxes here, right? We have what I call like organic, so like your traditional NIL and marketing opportunities. So you think about how brands engage in this space and players are representing, and there's endorsement opportunities. That's in my like traditional organic bucket. Then we have synthetic, which you alluded to with the collective. That is a market that has been created by donors that are creating separate entities that are helping to support athletes in this NIL endeavor. Some may call it pay for play, and we're getting very close to that, right? And so as you think about the landscape, where we started, where we're at today, and the pertinent issues, right now we're dealing with helping our schools think through what's to come, what's next. We are in a free revenue sharing environment right now. So as an institution, how do you proactively prepare for that? As an athletic director on campus, as a president, as general counsel, considering what that looks like, risks involved in that, right? And so on the day-to-day, that's what we're doing. We're helping our schools navigate what's to come, be proactive and be prepared for it, knowing that there are several drivers of this change. No one can probably tell you exactly what that future model will look like today. But we know that, as Mr. Kessler highlighted, there's no shortage of litigation. We're looking at legislation as well as state-by-state patchwork that's involved in this. And then also proactive measures with President Baker and Project D1 and really looking at how to maybe look at college sports in this landscape through a different lens.
This is so interesting because I think a number of you alluded to the idea that we are kind of waiting for the next iteration of what's about to happen. And the NCAA, for many people, I think is a pretty terrible organization until it's gone or changed in some fundamental way. Are we going to miss something from the current way that college sports is situated? If it all is litigated away or, like for all of it, or collective bargained away or collectived away, is there something to miss about it?
No. So what this reminds me of, and Michelle will appreciate this, when I started out in sports law, there was no free agency in professional sports. Young people, by the way, young sports fans, can't that, but the statement at the time by all those in the leagues was that this will destroy sports. Fans will hate it. It will ruin the joy and the beauty of the sports. It will do all these horrible, terrible things. So now we've had it for like 35 years, and it's done none of those things. What it's done is enhance fan interest. It has helped teams who never had a chance of competing to compete. It has enriched the lives of the athletes who generate the revenue and deserve that revenue. And again, if you talk to young fans today who have grown up with this, they can't imagine even what those arguments are. If we were to get the NCAA rules eliminated today, I assure you 30 years from now, nobody will miss them and no one will understand that. And let me be clear, I'm not talking about the things the NCAA does that it should do more of and better, right? No one objects to their educational requirements, that these be students. They should do more and a better job of promoting the athletes to finish their education and do those things, right? No one objects to the NCAA, who should do more to worry about things like the safety of the athletes. By the way, that's how the NCAA started. When Teddy Roosevelt formed the NCAA, it was to protect safety. It wasn't to be a wage cartel, right? So somehow that mission got diverted somewhere. No one will change the NCAA tournament that everyone loves. Because what you love about the NCAA tournament is when a school that doesn't give sports scholarships even from the Patriot League beats a high seed. That will always be there. And it will always be part of it. And by the way, no one's going to change or do anything other than enhance Title IX, right? There is nothing inconsistent with the model of athletes being compensated in Title IX. I personally hope that Title IX is interpreted to apply in the future to any compensation and payments are done. But you know why? That'll be more for all the athletes. That'll be more for the male athletes and the female athletes. So this all can live together. And the idea that somehow this edifice is going to come tumbling down because of change, the change has already happened. The change happened when the two strength and conditioning coaches at Alabama each make $1 million a year, which is more than the president of Alabama makes. Okay? If they only make $500,000 and those athletes, largely black athletes on the football team, got a little of that money, no one is going to think that's a bad thing, right? Except the people who are trying to hold up and prop up that system. And what I will say is that I think, for example, President Baker, he gets it. You see his proposal. I mean, right now, President Baker agrees schools should pay directly for NIL. Our lawsuit agrees that these schools should be able to pay directly for NIL, and the state of Virginia now agrees that the schools should be able to pay directly for the NIL. What are we waiting for, right? It's time for changes now.
So let me just step back a second. I don't disagree with anything that Jeffrey just said. But in law school, the classic answer is, it depends, right? It depends on what comes instead. One of my concerns is, and Jeffrey's right, the transformation has already started to happen, so it's how do you address it? Is up to now, the key to all of this, at least for Title IX and a whole lot of other areas, is that these are educational institutions. And that athletics is an extracurricular activity at an educational institution. And it should be looked at through that lens. And the fear is it gets turned into even more of a global, massive corporate employment sports industry. And education gets minimized. And I know that's not what Jeffrey's cases are pushing for, but I don't doubt that there are some big money people who might be pushing for that. And there might be some college, there might be people who support some big football school who say, I don't care if it's pro or not, I don't care. As long as we can put the name of my school on it, we can go ahead, and who cares whether they get educated. And then there's a serious problem. And to give them equal athletic financial aid and equal opportunities. And you can't get around it by having booster clubs. Because the booster clubs, the courts have held, are part of the university. As the money is coming from the booster club, it still fits. And where this is going to be going, I guarantee you, is you can't go get around it through collectives or anything else. You can't use collectives as a way of sort of ducking responsibility for complying with Title IX. In the University of Oregon, we were looking at this when we saw a coming collision between collectives and Title IX. Between NIL and Title IX. And a colleague of mine, Carrie Joshi, and I wrote an article for Sportico that basically said, look, let's be clear. If it really is a totally independent third party, if Pizza Hut announced, we're going to give $500 to every football player every month, and nothing to any women athletes. If they're truly independent, Title IX doesn't apply, because they're not an educational institution receiving federal funds. But if they are, Pizza Hut is the official NIL supporter of this university, or the logo for the university is put on the Pizza Hut boxes, or they support each other in one of 100 different ways, like who's the person we want to recruit this week? Can you make sure they get more pizza? Any of that, the school starts getting involved. Then Title IX absolutely applies. And that's what we've done in the Oregon case. When we went online, you just go online and put in University of Oregon NIL, and you'll come up with the official University of Oregon collective to help get NIL money for athletes. and you'll come up with the official University of Oregon NIL marketplace for the athletes to get money. So we've gone after it all. And with Jeffrey's work, where it is pushing, is for the schools to just be open about it, and they're actively identified as NIL is in the school, as part of the school. So both through my efforts and through this trend, NIL is going to come in there too. And then it comes down to, again, unless something goes very wrong, all that money has to be covered. The treatment that comes from it has to be equal to.
But any thoughts there on the,
Yeah.
what are we missing?
Absolutely. I think this is a great time to be a student athlete. When you think about athlete rights, and where we're at today and where we have come from, we're not going backwards, right? And so I think that institutions will continue to fulfill their academic missions. I think that athletes will continue to compete at high levels. I think coaches will continue to coach, leaders will continue to lead, in this model of what it looks like will look a little bit different, but I think it's a great thing for student athletes, the opportunity to monetize on their NIL, and I think it's an opportunity for leaders across the country to support them in this effort. When you think about an athletics department, we have all of these areas that surround an athlete. We provide them with sports nutrition, strength and conditioning. We have all these staff that are surrounding them to help them be successful. This part of it, NIL is another part of it. And so we talk about, will we miss anything? I think, college athletics will be fine. We're going to figure it out. But also I think it's just a great time to be a student athlete as well. I'm a former student athlete, and I would have loved to have the opportunity to monetize in this environment. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Yeah. Michelle, do you have anything to add?
Not really. I mean, I can't imagine, having sat in the seat that I did, I can't imagine a scenario where the NBPA did not exist. I can't imagine it. And despite the fact that we've been unionized for over a decade, it's still been the case that every year we have improved the lives of our athletes. There's always been something that we could do and insisted that be done to improve the lives of our athletes, and that's because there is a union. So it doesn't strike me as being something that we have to fear. I do agree that the Title IX question is a legitimate one, and I don't frankly know how that needle is going to be threaded, but I am confident it can be. But the notion that there's anything that's going to harm this college sports because kids are getting paid, I'll have to be 150 years old before I believe that, and I'm almost there. But I just don't see why we can't figure out a way to make sure that we maintain equity while we're empowering these students in ways that they deserve. So I think we're going to figure this out.
It's a bit of a straw argument, I think, sometimes to pit the interest of the college players against the interest of those who are looking at Title IX and want to maintain that equity. And sometimes that's the way it's framed when I don't know that it necessarily has to be.
Well, let me address it a second. I think part of it is part of it is political activity. It's like we can stop what we don't like coming by threatening. If you make us do what we don't want to do, we'll get rid of women's sports, or we'll get rid of Olympic sports. We'll get rid of everything but football and basketball. That's why you shouldn't touch us. So I think there is a political threat there. I think there's also a thought process that is, if you view sports as supposed to be making money, and that all the money that comes from sports can only be given to sports, well, that's a very different thing than how we were supposed to think about it in an educational institution. Now, the truth is about the money. I mean, astonishingly, this first came up in the Title IX case against Brown University. Hardly a moneymaker. But where they said when we sued for they're trying to eliminate some women's teams and we sued for equal treatment for the women athletes, Brown said, well, our football team should count differently because we should be allowed to treat them better because they're revenue producing. And we said, revenue producing? What are you talking about? You're losing hundreds of thousands of dollars on football every year. And he said, yeah, but we're bringing in a bunch, right? And so the judge basically said, look, and we said, if you want to call a company that is bringing in a bunch of money and losing a whole lot more every year revenue producing, why don't you just call it going bankrupt? And, you know, that's what we could call it. It doesn't matter. The point is, these are not supposed to be making money. They're not their primary goal. Their primary goal is to be an extracurricular activity for the student athletes. Yes, if there is making money, then fine. Share it evenly and appropriately, etc. But it doesn't get you to, oh, the fact that we're making money, and the other threat was, we're making so much money, we can and I want to be clear, my understanding is that over 90%, 95% of the college athletic departments are losing money. So I think the number was, the last time we ran the number, something like 30 colleges in America are making money on athletics. 28. I want to qualify my expert witness over here. Yes. Right, 28 colleges in the whole country are making money on athletics.
I'll unionize those schools, man.
Yeah,
Right.
so let me just
Yeah,
say something, okay? That's not true. That's what they report, okay? Because if you report a loss of money because you're paying your athletic director $3.5 million because you have the money, and then you say you have a $100,000 loss, you're making money, okay? Here's what people have to get in their heads. The Power 5 schools are not like everybody else. So you really have to think about it as a different animal. Because those schools are making, each of them, hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay? About 55, 60 schools. And the reason we get tied in knots is because we conflate those schools who have developed these gigantic independent commercial businesses, okay, with the schools who are still just educational institutions with extracurricular activities. And when you try to come up with one rule for all, you go crazy, right? And that is what has to be done here. So you have to look at these schools differently. For the ones with the money, there is plenty of money to compensate the athletes and share it with the women's sports. Okay? Let me finish. Yes, sorry. How do I know that? Because history tells me that when they didn't allow full scholarships, which they didn't allow until after Obama, the school said, if we have to pay full scholarships, we're only going to pay it for the men's sports at the Power 5, and we're going to eliminate the women's sports. Instead, they paid it to everybody. When we had the Alston case, they said if we're allowed to give out all these educational benefits, we will give it only, and that case was brought for football and basketball only. We'll only give it to them, and we're going to eliminate those other sports. What happened? They gave it to everybody. Okay? If these new benefits are allowed at those schools, okay, you look at their revenues, okay? Just the average annual growth in their revenues, average annual growth is more than the cost of every dollar they spend today on their women's teams. They can swallow that up and fund that without blinking an eye. Those are those schools, okay? For the rest of the schools, frankly, the compensation is if you don't have a football team making $180 million, okay, your football athletes are not going to get that money. And they'll still, whatever they can do, they will do. And the women will get equal at those schools. And that's what everyone has to get their heads around. Once you divide it all up, this is not hard. It is only hard if you're saying, well, how will Lehigh be able to afford all this? They won't, and they won't pay it. And if your concern is that, well, Lehigh then won't be able to compete with Alabama in football, okay, that's your concern.
You have to disclose what those revenues are, make them available, put them in a pile. and then they would have to get divided up. Who is it? You know, how would that affect Title IX? And your answer was?
Why is it?
No, Michelle's
No, I'm
answer.
sorry, you
Yeah,
told
yeah.
me.
Your answer was that, well, the college, their half of the revenue,
Yeah.
they take it out of that.
Absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's Jeffrey's right. This is a no-brainer, and that's how it's handled. And the other thing is, you're talking about Lehigh. I find if the students at Lehigh organize and they realize that Lehigh literally doesn't make any money, and they find that out because now they've got the right to inspect, then they won't get paid. Right? It's not going to destroy anything. If on the other hand, you got a big school that's making millions, billions of dollars, I'm going to find that out because I now have the right to inspect, and then I'm going to get paid. I'm not getting all the money, just like with the NBA. I get a portion of the revenue, and then the university has its own portion of the revenue to manage what it has to do legally, i.e. pay the women. So that this, I don't see, and again, I'm always allowing that I'm not.
I say in these cases, I don't care about the money, you gotta treat the women equally, it doesn't matter. But I'm always confounded by with the threats from the college coach, athletic directors and everything about how is it that for these activities, somehow the money for athletics is viewed as independent from and separate from the rest of the school's budget. Because you wouldn't say, well, if the drama, if the school play that's put on every year loses money, why wouldn't you cut pay? I mean, it's sort of, how did the finances for athletics get put in their own little separate black box?
It's also really weird, maybe it's not weird, maybe it's insidious, this idea that somehow the football players, okay, now think of the composition of those teams, okay, think of the composition of the teams that are giving up the money. What is that wealth transfer about? Okay, why is it their responsibility to do that, as opposed to the same way you fund the drama department or the foreign language department or anybody else in the school, right? Just like Division III, right? Division III has all their sports. They have no revenues coming from their football teams or their basketball teams to support those sports. You support them because it's good for your school, because it's good for your athletes, because it's attractive, and because Title IX requires some of this too, right? So again, a lot of things get thrown in here that I like the word like scare tactics, but that's what they are. And as these changes come about, it's going to be revealed that none of these scare tactics are actually grounded in reality if this is allowed to emerge in the right way.
As you're looking at like athletic departments and how they're set up, you alluded to the revenues, right, and how that differs from other areas across campus. Like you're selling football tickets, you have multimedia rights partners. There are areas that are generating revenue within athletic departments, and so that is where it differs a little bit from the art department, right? You're filling stadiums, arenas, you have fans, you have donors that are giving to programs that they want to see win, and also be able to recruit top athletes across the country to help them win, right? And so that's where some of those the constituents, the stakeholders differ a little bit in college athletic departments, and to think about that difference and how we add a layer of athlete, commercial opportunity is how many athletic departments right now are approaching this. In this pre-revenue sharing environment is, okay, we have these areas, we have these buckets of revenue. How do we potentially add another bucket that may be compensation that goes directly to athletes? As we think about where we're headed right now. And so I think to your point, we had the Austin Fund, we had cost of attendance, all of these differences and change that came about throughout college athletics, and we've been able to navigate it. And this is another area, right? This is another area of opportunity, but I also think that it's a little bit different because it's in the commercialization space, right? And so I think that across the country, we're going to see athletic departments be more innovative in how to generate revenue to help support athletes in this space. Should we be able to pay athletes directly? Should that change? And so, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is it's a very good time in college athletics and a very good time for us to think about how to be innovative and creative when it comes to generating revenue, when it comes to fundraising dollars, and how that will help us support this new, era of college athletics as well.
Yeah, and when it comes, Michelle, to paying athletes, given the complicated nature of, Division I NCAA, where you have football schools, you have different sports, men's and women's sports, how would you even think about a union? Is it a single entity? Is it an entity for each sport? Who's doing the bargaining? Is it a college sophomore who's new to the idea of labor relations and economics?
Probably not. I mean, it's like every other union, you will have professionals that the union subsidizes, pays, that will engage in the bargaining. I mean, do you think that LeBron James is doing CBA negotiation? No. It was the executive director, Jeffrey, and his team, and my team that did that. So, and you're right, it may be that there will be a separate union for the women athletes, probably not, but it may be that the union for college basketball and football players at some of the big schools will be one separate union, and there's no limitation on what that membership looks like. And I concede it will be different. It will be different from professional sports in that there are competing interests and there may be conflicts that make it make sense to have separate unions. But that's not an explanation that should end the discussion about unionization. It's just going to be different. And maybe that certain schools will have a single union. It will depend.
So what would the core principles be for that union? What do you see at the college level? How would you translate it?
It would not be simply a revenue share. That's not the case with any professional union either. Most of the work that we do, it doesn't involve, maybe the most important part to the players is the revenue share, but there's so much more. So when you talk about things like student athletes' rights, those things, if the NCAA or the individual schools aren't doing a good enough job, they will once there's a CBA in place. So it's not only money, it's health and safety. It's health and safety. It's not the case that a union shouldn't have its members practicing and using a restroom in a facility with no doors. Not my union, right? Those are things that you can collectively bargain that are not necessarily tethered to the revenue generation.
So I think the system has a lot of chaos right now. We're not quite sure where it's heading. If you could create something that
is, if we move to what Jeffrey's talking about, and I want to be clear as I understand it, antitrust law violations could be found, and it's entirely separate from whether the students are employees, and that's entirely separate from whether they're unions, and all of which is entirely separate from whether the schools comply with Title IX. Is that right?
They're all
right.
Completely independent one of the other.
Right. So we not sort of get confused about that. But my fear is, particularly in this area where everything is uncertain, when we're talking about big money, there are so many sharks out there that will be going after these kids with talent. And there is no way the longer my instinct is, I don't want to claim this as my legal expertise, but my just gut instinct is, the longer this is uncertain, the more kids are going to get taken advantage of horribly and fooled out of stuff and become victimized by sharks out looking to get their money. And the sooner we can actually reach an agreement on a system that makes sense and works, the better our chances of sort of minimizing that, is my instinct. But as to the only principle I can say in terms of how it should best work is I look at this and I see I spent 35 years as a public interest lawyer. I spent my whole life really wanting to be a public interest lawyer and make sure the law is just. So I look at this system and I say, what are the injustices here? And when I just say, look, there are first massive sex discrimination in college athletics right now. Massive. Like I said, over 90% of the colleges are in violation of Title IX. There's massive exploitation, economic and other exploitation of college athletes right now in the industry, including all the stuff that Jeff was talking about, including all the stuff we haven't even talked about the sexual abuse and all those kinds of mental health things from the previous program. And there's massive race discrimination in intercollegiate athletics, which is what Jeff was talking about the vast majority of the players in football and basketball, men and women. And so the system, if we're designing it, those cry out for change. It's how do we design it to stop that? And still, like happen is really important. Just let them actually play sports and, learn the benefits of things. Learn what we all learn from playing. So I don't have a more concrete system. Sorry, Jeff may have given more thought. That's my input.
Okay, it's a good place to start, though. Right the wrong.
Right. That's my motto.
So there are lots of possibilities as to where this could end up. One possibility is that it ends up in a system which is what the relief in our cases would lead to if we won all of our cases, which is that the NCAA economic regulations of compensation are all enjoined. But individual conferences are able to compete with each other to set their own path. And when that would happen, I believe, is lead to a market in which, whether it's a Power 5 or Power 4, those individual conferences will set a one marketplace standard that will develop based on the revenues that they earn, in which athletes will get fairly compensated, and that will develop. And other conferences that don't have those revenues will have different rules and different systems, just like the Ivy League to this day doesn't allow sports scholarships, neither does the Patriot League, which you can have individual differences in terms of that. So that's like one possible scenario that can happen. Another possible scenario is that we eventually end up in a world of unions for the athletes. If that happens, that actually supplants antitrust, right? And you would have this negotiated and bargained through some future unionization, at least in some number of the schools or some group of the schools, as to how that would work, and that would lead to all these things being addressed. Another possibility is that this all gets settled in our litigations, in which we agree on a new system with the NCAA. There are proposals out there by President Baker, which would compensate the athletes, do it in a variety of ways, support women's sports, and do other things. And there are systems that could be negotiated as part of a settlement of these various class actions and things. That's really up to the NCAA, right? They'd have to decide if they actually could agree on what it is they would agree to, that we would agree to. Right? And then the court would have to prove it all in the system. So that's a possible way this could all go. The NCAA would also say that they see a possible way through Congress. I think that is the least likely way. Because until Congress can agree on anything else, I'm not sure that they're ever going to agree on anything would be good for college sports, nor by the way do I trust Congress.
I was going to say,
you
don't
on
want
anything.
them.
Could agree, it wouldn't be something I think anybody would want. So I think that's the least likely path for resolving this. But there are a lot of different paths, and one of them, or some combination of them, are going to come to fruition.
If the NCAA was smart, and they may be evil, but I don't think they're stupid, they probably do want a negotiated deal, right?
I can't speak for that.
Sure.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think, when you talk about the NCAA and taking a proactive measure and creating a model that the membership has come along and also been a part of what that looks like, would be ideal. And then also just to add to that in what that model looks like is clarity around the rules, competitive equity. Like those are the things that we're hearing a lot from leaders across the country, from coaches, is just how to understand the do's and the don'ts, the clarity around what this looks like. It's a little bit different now, right? And so as we're helping a lot of schools navigate how to approach the changes that are coming, and they're very much one-off changes. You think about last month, Tennessee, Virginia injunction. That changes what that looks like in terms of recruiting inducements, right? And so schools are now trying to think through, what does this look like what does this look like for us today? How do we approach this, right? And so I think some clarity around what that looks like and structure is what is needed, but I think you just highlighted just the potential ways that we might come about that, yeah. And each outcome would have different settings.
And it changes every day.
Yep.
I think just the day before yesterday, there's no more waiting period for the transfer portal.
Yeah.
Whether you do it 1, 2, or 3 times, that's a direct result of antitrust litigation by the states, not by me, but the state deciding our cases, have achieved that because they wanted a preliminary injunction to strike down the transfer portal rules, and the NCAA looked at it and said, you know what? We're getting rid of the transfer portal rules. So that's now happened. And guess what? We'll destroy college sports. It won't do anything except make it fairer for the athletes.
And also to add to that, we're also looking at institutional involvement. Like at some point, institutions were hands off. Now we're looking at D1 Council, board of directors that will vote here shortly about institutional involvement and institutions being able to be hands-on and facilitate, deals for athletes. And so we've seen just the evolution of the landscape over time, and I think you're absolutely right.
I actually agree 100% with that movement.
Yeah.
There wouldn't be collectives if the rules didn't prohibit the institutions from being involved in providing the NIL payments. The only reason the collectives were formed was to try to comply with the ban on that. And everyone's looked at it and said, maybe that's not a good thing. It would be better to have the schools directly do this instead of this bizarre system of having private groups do it, right?
Well, and that also then eliminates the attempt to use the collectives to avoid responsibility for Title IX compliance, right? So that helps all the way around. I mean, one thing I think is also important, and I understand we're all focused on intercollegiate athletics, and that's why we're here. But I think particularly given where we are, it's important to emphasize a key piece not get lost, which is the importance of education. And I'm sitting here listening to these panels talking about, college athletes who don't know how to read. When I talk about fixing the righting the wrongs, that's wrong number one. And it's got to be, when we're looking on changing the system or fixing the system, is how do we fix the system so that stops happening? And so we actually make sure if these are college athletes, they get a college education and benefit from it.
And that's where the NCAA could do a lot better job, right? So for example, the NCAA purports to have a rule that they passed a couple of years ago, which said athletes could only put in 20 hours a week for their team. Okay? That rule's in effect.
Are you kidding?
Okay, that rule's in effect. The NCAA then does surveys, which they admit shows that the athletes put in 45 hours to 50 hours a week for their teams. By the way, in season and out of season. Doesn't change. But that's because all those other hours are voluntary, right? And except that, like, your coach won't play you if you don't volunteer for all of this additional activity, right? So why hasn't the NCAA reacted to that issue and really had rules that said, you know what, you can't come involuntary or involuntary, so you can have time to be students and do all that. Why? Because what they're focused on is that athletes shouldn't be able to get compensated so that the weight coaches can be, right? There's something fundamentally wrong. There are positive things the NCAA can do, and none of it has to do with restricting what the athletes can be paid.
And that was the point I was trying to make about if you're going the route of unionization, those are the kinds of issues. I mean, I remember negotiating days off, right? And the league didn't volunteer that, the teams didn't, but now it's mandatory. We negotiated when you could have another practice depending upon what time the plane landed in the hometown. I mean, there are things that are negotiated that have nothing whatsoever to do with revenue. And if the NCAA, I'm astounded to hear that, the notion that they only practice 20 hours a week. Are you kidding me?
That includes games too, by the way.
Are you kidding? That's ridiculous. And so,
Wait, they're filing rules?
and that's my point. It has got to be, if the NCAA won't do its job, and that is to protect these students, then some other entity has to do it for these students. Give me an alternative to a union.
The trade crew.
Well, and that's here's a serious point, speaking of education. If you had the hundreds of thousands of college players nationally who were engaged in what it meant to be a member of a union, learning about what their rights were, how they could negotiate, how to use collective action to force change. Boy, would that be an education. And could it disrupt, I mean, honestly, could it have an impact on nationally on a labor market, future labor market?
First off, it's happening on college campuses now anyway. Non-athletes who are students are organizing. My own undergrad, which is, trust me, it's not an athletic school. My own undergrad is now facing or contending with students that are organizing. So I don't see any negatives with respect to students understanding the power of collective bargaining. I don't see it as an evil that's going to destroy the labor market as we know it. In fact, I think exactly the opposite, that it does allow workers to appreciate that they are not at the mercy of their employers all the time, that there are things that they have the right to bargain for. So, I admit my bias, but I don't see it as something that's going to be harmful to our country.
The Dartmouth basketball players were organized by the same union who organized the graduate student teaching assistants and other groups of students in the school, and they just moved over to the basketball team to do that. So there are real unions out there who are interested in organizing athletes and students in general when they work.
I'm going to open it up to questions if anybody has any. Okay. Hello. We got quite a few. Let's get the mic passed around. While we wait, I have a question for Brittany, which is on the collective. Do you have any information on whether or not donors, individual university donors how much money is getting siphoned off for name, image, and likeness, and how much of it is affecting that larger kind of donor class issue?
Yeah, I think that depends institution to institution. That looks different. What we've seen is across the country, it's usually a small group of donors that are contributing in this way to NIL and supporting in this space. And they're also contributing in other areas. It may be through scholarship, through the foundation. And so we're seeing nationally just more donors are open to supporting athletes in this space. I think early on you saw a divide in education. You had the kind of doom and gloom, this is all going to ruin college sports, and now we're at a place where the collectives are up, they're operating. It is a part of the landscape, whether some agree with it, think that it'll be long-term, part of what it looks like in the long term, but it is part of the current landscape and what that looks like right now. And it's very hard to give you numbers because each school, as we talk about some of the higher resource schools, those numbers may be higher in terms of the collective and how they're supporting the athletes. And then also, if the collective is all sports or focused on certain specific sports. And so it varies across the country.
Yeah, quick question. So obviously there's various tiers, those top schools and then Division 2 and 3 and so forth. Has any of these rules have any effect on like the NAI, the National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics, which is smaller schools? That's one question. Any effect of all this stuff on NAI? And then the second question is the NIL. I think I've read somewhere that maybe like high school students are getting involved in NIL. If you're like the biggest star in Texas football or whatever. So comments on that, please.
So the answer is for the NAIA, I think there are rules that allow NIL, that there isn't that much NIL money available, but if an athlete can make it, they can make it. And by the way, there's other kinds of NIL that you don't even think about, right? Which is that, now athletes can be social influencers, and many of them are good at that. And they go on and they develop a real following and earn money the same way other students can. And to do that, I think now in the NAIA, it has nothing to do with collectors or anything like that, but just changing that system has been a good thing, for those athletes. But a lot of these other things follow the revenue. So if there's no revenue, it doesn't have that much of an impact. But they should have the rights anyway. So to the extent that they can be influencers or whatever they can do, they should be able to do, right? There's no reason to deny them that. In terms of, what was your second question? High school. So yes, there's a state law issue here. So because the NCAA no longer disqualifies you if you receive NIL, then that used to be the barrier. High school athletes who wanted to play in states are allowing it. So yes, in those states that allow it, there have been some high school athletes who've been able to earn money, which is really no different, if you think about it, than, young tennis players or golfers who started, playing professionally at 16 years old or something, earning endorsements. Why shouldn't a young basketball player be able to do that if there's a market for them to do that? So yes, that's there.
Thank you. Michelle, you said something to the effect of in this future world, why shouldn't athletes who are generating revenue make the same amount of money or generate revenue for themselves? And you phrase it as, why shouldn't the kids make money if the coaches in the universities are? Something to that effect, right? And my question is, how should we make sure that it is kids? And should we make sure it is kids? In this brave new world where athletes are getting paid, if Patrick Mahomes wants to go home to Texas Tech and they're willing to pay him, why shouldn't Texas Tech put him on the field?
That's a rhetorical question, right?
No. Why shouldn't University of Alabama compete with the Kansas City Chiefs for talent? That is a true free market, right?
I don't know football, so I'm assuming Patrick Mahomes is Make him LeBron James, and then I agree with you.
I don't know what his college is, but
I don't know.
Why shouldn't the University of Alabama
LeBron didn't go to
compete with
college.
the LA Lakers?
He went straight from high school.
He came in under the one and done rule.
Why shouldn't the college teams be able to compete
Hire
with the
To
professionals.
hire anybody they want. Why do they have to be students? We're calling them athletes, not student athletes. If the point is to field the best football team or basketball.
I mean, I wasn't aware that that you could hire a professional to be to I mean,
We hire professionals to teach, except for maybe me.
I mean, I can't take the question seriously, to be honest with you, because I cannot imagine that there would be any.
Years of corruption we're talking about today. You don't think a college would hire 28-year-olds
Well, if that were to happen, that would kill college.
Let's let the answer come
I
out.
just don't think that that's realistically something that we have to worry about.
What I think almost everyone agrees to, certainly I agree to, is that what does make college sports different is that you have to be students at the school, right? And that I don't think anyone wants to change that aspect of it. There's just no reason why if you're a student at the school, you can't also be compensated just like a student at the school who works. If you're the editor-in-chief of the newspaper in many schools today, guess what? The school pays you a salary. If you are working at the bookstore at the school, you're a student, and guess what? You do a job for the school, you get paid for it. But you're still a student. I don't think anybody's proposing, because if you were going to say you don't have to be a student, then you're just saying, just make it an independent professional league, which is, just another league. What is unique, I think, Just like the Olympics is unique because the athletes are from their countries, right? Not because they don't get paid. They used to say that. Remember, they said you shouldn't get paid. Now you can get paid. And you can be an Olympic athlete. It's nothing to do with compensation. But it's because you're a citizen of your country. You should be a student at your school. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. I always do. I don't.
Hey.
We've got another question back here.
Okay, so that was kind of random.
That would be unfortunate.
So, Jen Fry here. So I have a few thoughts, questions, and concerns. And I come from someone who coached at Division I school, Illinois. We played for a national championship, Big Ten. I also coached at Norfolk State. So I have both ideas. And Michelle, I'm going to kind of push back on this idea that it's equal to the basketball. Basketball has 540 athletes. Brown itself might have 700. So there's a very different, and there's a scale of the athletes. If we're talking about unionization, is it the golf players who are going to union? Is it going to be, tennis?
If they want to.
Well, but so we think about, but then we also have
make
to,
any money.
but we also have to think about then the weight on the staff. Because that's not thought about, the weight on the staff. Are all these staff members going to then have to fight with unions? It can get ugly, but my main question is, if we're talking about paying athletes, does that include their scholarship? Because if you're paying an athlete, is it going to mean that we still pay for their food, their travel? Does it mean that we still pay for their uniforms? Does it mean the strength and conditioning is still coming out of that? Academics is still coming out of that? Creative is still coming out of that? Because the money, if we're going to talk about paying athletes, we have to have the high level and then everyone else. Because these everyone else schools are barely getting by. And we know that even though they might not have money, what's going to happen is that they're going to fire staff members to pay athletes. So now athletes' health is at risk. Because the Norfolk State, we didn't have the money to pay athletes, but they would have tried to find it. So maybe a way to solve it is that these football coaches, basketball coaches shouldn't get a $300,000 bonus. That can be distributed amongst the athletes. They shouldn't get a $200,000 academic bonus.
That's what a market would do.
Huh?
That is exactly what a market would do. The reason for the incredibly high salaries that not just the head coaches, but the assistant coaches, that the athletic director, people like that make, is because at the schools that have all these revenues, they have no shareholders, they are nonprofits. So what do you do with that money? It has to be spent. And the athletic department says, well, we're keeping it in the athletic department. We're not going to spend it on some poet. So where does it go? So it goes to exactly what you're saying.
But that's the high-level ones, not the low-level ones.
That's what I'm saying. The non-revenue schools will not pay this money because the athletes are not generating the revenues. That's, again, it's the mistake to think that the same system is going to be in place. Just like in the Ivy League, they don't give out any sports scholarships. It will not be the same everywhere. It will be where you have massive revenues being generated. That will be one result. Where you have sports that have very little or no revenues, it'll look a lot like it does today, except athletes will be able to do NIL or stuff like that on their own, but it's not going to change the dynamic of those schools.
Got you. So, but do you think that the payment will also include the scholarships the same? That's my main thing. Will the scholarships stay the same and then there's revenue on top of that? Or is the scholarship leaving?
It depends on the school. Again, if the Ivy League, they don't give athletic scholarships there. So one of the things, actually, I think, if that Dartmouth Union ever gets bargaining, they're not bargaining for above that. They may say, hey, can't we have athletic scholarships? Like everybody else. I mean, and working conditions and many other things. It's not going to be about getting massive amounts of revenue because the team doesn't generate massive amounts of revenue. So it's going to vary in terms of how this works out.
Appreciate it.
One over here.
Hi. Hi. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay.
So first of all, this has been an incredibly interesting panel. I actually came back for this panel. I'm an athletic director at a Division I school. However, we are not one of those, whether it's 28 or 60, as you said, Jeffrey, we're not one of those 60 schools who are who are profiting on making revenue in the black, however you want to pose it. A couple of items that jump out at me, and I could be here all day with this, but a couple of items that jump out. You talked about one of the ways of settling or putting in a new system would be to turn back control over to the conferences, if you will, right? That's the system we have in football. Right now, the NCAA cannot govern football. Football is governed by the SEC, the Big Ten, Big 12. They go out and make their own television deals. The NCAA doesn't share in those. Right? These bowl programs that they do, that the NCAA does, has nothing to do with it. They don't negotiate that championship. So that formula already exists in football. The concern I have as an athletic director is that the NCAA generates almost 85 to 90% of its money. I can get the exact number because I'm on the basketball team, right? From the CBS contract, the CBS TNT contract, right, for March Madness. That's where most of the money for the NCAA comes from. What schools like myself are concerned about, right, is that we establish a system, like you just said, where the Power 5 schools say, okay, you know what? We're going to take over March Madness. Why should Lehigh and Dartmouth and Cornell and those schools participate in the television revenue program that we generate the revenue for, right? And second, I just want to say one more second point. When you talk about looking at a system where, let's say, why does Charlie Baker want Congress to come in? The concern now, if you settle your cases, right, that there's nowhere to stop Florida or California or Virginia of instituting different rules, right, for the universities in their state. And what ends up happening is we're still about competition, and we don't want schools like UCLA having to compete with schools like Florida, and they're competing with different rules. Florida says you can have 90 scholarships. UCLA says you can have 120. Right? If the working distance can be different. So that's why Charlie Baker wants Congress to get involved, so that there's the federal rules, of course, that apply to everyone. Right? I disagree with that. I agree with you. Anytime you have Congress coming involved in something, it's detrimental to your business or detrimental to the entity. Right? But I don't see either one of the two solutions you talked about, right, being also answers to some of the queries.
Right. So let me ask a lot of interesting questions. First of all, we don't have what I'm talking about in conference control over athlete compensation for football. The NCAA regulates that, not the conferences. What you're talking about is that they get together and they control the college football playoff. And the money to that as opposed to the NCAA tournament. Right? So that's like them getting together on the revenue side. What I'm talking about is them being separate, not all together. Under my system, the SEC and the Big Ten can't agree on how to compensate their athletes. They compete against each other in competition with decide the answer, not their collective voice. So that's one thing. On the NCAA tournament, they will never break away from the NCAA tournament because the television attractiveness of that tournament is because your school might get to that tournament and beat one of those schools with that money. That is what attracts the eyeballs. That is what has the value to it. So unlike in the college football playoff, which is a different animal, that's not what that's about. The NCAA tournament is about because in any game, any school can beat any school. That's what sells that. That's the value. And so under any system that's evolved, you're still going to have the NCAA tournament. Your school's still going to have an opportunity to get into your conference, whatever school and conference it is. That is not going to change. The last thing you raised is, what about states in terms of this? My personal belief, knowing who pushes the state legislation and why, okay, it doesn't come out of thin air, okay, is that if these NCAA rules were gone and the conferences were deciding their own rules to allow these things, there would be nobody pushing the states to do anything else. If there was a system, what pushes this and why the states got involved in the first place was the sense that the NCAA system is so fundamentally unfair in different ways that whenever anybody wants to go for it, so one remedy you have is go to your state and try to do it that way. And then other states have to follow, because as you see, as soon as one state allows something, I can guarantee you, Virginia passed the law, you will have 10 more states or laws within the next month. In terms of that, that's just how it goes. In terms of that, but if you had one system that everyone thought is fair, you're not going to see that. That's at least my view in terms of that. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, I just would like to add that California was the first NIL state, and the second was my home state of Nebraska, because they know that if the California is going to allow NIL, Nebraska's got no shot at those recruits, unless it did follow suit. Yes.
Hi, my name's Raul Candelaria. I'm a third-year PhD student here at Howard University in the Department of Communication, Culture, and Media Studies, currently working on my dissertation. Since we're talking about possibly a different system, and we're talking about equity and opportunity and compensation, and we're at the Mecca, HU, one of the things that I haven't heard, at least from this panel as well as the other panels, but addressing this issue, is how would this equity and composition be dealt with or looked at for HBCUs? We have very unique universities. Their history is very unique. The student athletes bring a lot to the brands of these universities as well as to the culture, not just the culture of the university, but the intellect, meaning the academic rigor and the research that is produced by these universities. So when we look at the example that you brought up earlier, Mr. Kessler, of PWIs, that's predominantly white institutions, and what they do, when we look at football teams and what are the makeup of those teams versus maybe the golf team, which the makeup of the football teams are predominantly black and brown students. Here at these universities, obviously, we're looking at HBCUs and what they do, and their student makeup. So the question is, when we look at these different compensation, I guess, I don't know whether we call them levels or buckets, when we look at the Power 5 versus the smaller schools, is there any unique nuances or specifics that you would see regarding HBCUs and what they bring to the table in athletics, and particularly how their student athletes are uniquely positioned to help these universities and their brands and how these brands move forward?
Let me jump in first just with the note about Title IX, which is, no, I see no difference at all. I think Title IX should be equally applied to HBCUs. And I think historically, the women who get the shortest end of the stick is black women. And it's true at the HBCUs too. Most of the HBCUs are in clear violation of Title IX when it comes to athletics. Without running through the numbers in Howard, I can just tell you I've run through the numbers. And so I think there should be no justification for violations of Title IX or any difference. But I don't know in terms of the rest of you.
So, NIL is great opportunity for the HBCUs because it gives them an ability to promote their athletes to outside sponsors and others where they don't necessarily have the revenues in the school themselves, where someone can be a brand ambassador and do things to get attractive and do that. It actually, I think, is a good thing for the HBCUs in terms of that. You know, these opportunities, you looked at what Deion Sanders did at Jackson State, I think it was, right, before he went to Colorado. He was able to attract the level of athletes that they had never attracted before, part because of who he was, but in part because NIL started getting allowed and he was able to help promote them and do things. So I think there's opportunity there. In terms of these issues, the HBCUs are a lot like a lot of colleges. They don't have high revenue sports, so they're not going to be competing, if you will, with the Power 5 at that level, but they don't compete with the Power 5 at that level now, right? You have an athlete who's going, to play at Michigan State, is unlikely to choose an HBCU to play football at. Whether they should or not, it's just not the market that's out there in terms of that. But I think more freedom and more opportunity, and in my model, the conference of the HBCUs would decide their own rules as to what to do, what's right for them, so it all fit together in terms of that.
The only thing I'll add to that is, brands are getting more and more engaged in this space. And I do think that NIL is a good thing for HBCUs, and there are certain brands that are targeting athletes at HBCUs. And that opens the door to larger conversations, maybe with the institution as a whole, about how this brand, this company can be part of other type of partnerships across campus, right? And so I think it's a good thing. I think it opens doors. I think we need to continue to educate the student athletes at those institutions about how to get involved, how to get engaged, and how to optimize opportunities in the space.
Well, we're almost out of time. Do we have any final thoughts? Anything you want to impart the audience with before you head out?
I mean, what I would add is where I started, which is, look, I became a lawyer to make the world a better place. I think the primary goal of law is to achieve justice. And I'm saying if there's any institution in the country that is devoted to making things more right in the area of athletics, this is it. And so if you see what's wrong, spend your time fixing it and making it right.
The only thing I would say is that change is here, right? It is not going to stay the same. It's already different. And the best thing that everyone should think about is, okay, how can we make this change the most positive change for everyone involved? And I think that the schools should participate in that. I think the conferences should participate in that. I think the NCAA should participate in that. I don't think Congress should participate in that. But I think all the concerned actors should think about, let's stop living a vision that doesn't exist, right? Let's face the reality that's here, because it's going to happen. Right? And the question is, either you're going to be part of that change or it's going to happen and you're not going to be part of that change.
Well, can I just throw one more thing in? If you're a school administrator or you're currently at school, talk to me about how to check the Title IX numbers and see whether your school's in compliance. It's very easy to do. You don't have to wait for a lawsuit. You can just, get active yourself and go to that school and say, let's fix this. We don't have to wait for litigation. I just assume not have to wait for litigation. Let's just get the problem fixed. And I can show you how to find the numbers and find out whether your school is in violation or not. Sorry.
No, but they said.
Brittany, good.
I just reiterate, this is a great time for student athletes. This is a great time for college sports. We had the luncheon where many of the awardees were the award winners were former athletes, and they talked about the value of the education that they got, not only in the classroom but also in their sport. And so, I would say continue to support, institutions. If you're an administrator, continue to invest in resources to help support your athletes in this space, help to understand how to optimize opportunity. If you're a fan, get engaged. Learn how to be involved. If you're a donor, also do the same thing. And then also, just in general, continue the conversation, at a national level about the importance of college sports to our country, the importance of the value of education, and how that continues to play a role in what we do in a day-to-day. So, thank you.
Well, this has been incredibly illuminating for me. Anytime you can mention Teddy Roosevelt in 1906, which also was when the forward pass was instituted in college football, it's a great day. So thank you all very much for your time and your expertise.
Again, thank you to everyone on this panel for lending your time and expertise today. We have concluded our panel sessions. We would be remiss for not thanking the faculty and event management students from George Washington University who were in charge of managing this event.